Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going straight into a pretty significant address. It was delivered at the European Parliament.
Yeah, that's right. And not just any speech. This was from the vice president of the Serbian government, Aleksandar Vulin.
Okay, and the setting was a conference called Serbia's Path to the European Union, hosted by a sovereigntist group.
Exactly. Hosted by them and some MEPs. And the speech itself, well, it presented a really critical take on Serbia's relationship with the EU.
Suggesting a shift, maybe, from like an emotional view to something more rational.
Precisely. That's the core idea we need to unpack. It's about stepping back, looking at the history, the current reality, and less about, pure aspiration.
Right. So the speech, as you mentioned, it's framed like a first-person account of Serbia's journey with the EU. How did it start?
Well, it kicked off by describing an initial phase full of strong, positive feelings towards the EU, almost like a willingness to just forget past problems.
Forgiving past wrongs, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. The description was one of warmth, optimism, wanting closer ties, even if there were difficult historical points, a real emotional investment early on.
But that didn't last, obviously.
Yeah.
The speech then dives into specific events where the EU's actions were seen negatively.
It gets into some quite sensitive history, things like the EU's involvement as perceived by the speaker in the bombing of Serbia and Republika Srpska.
Okay.
Also the recognition of Kosovo's independence, and even allegations of interference in Serbian politics trying to undermine President Vučić.
Wow. Okay, so these aren't minor disagreements being raised.
No, they're presented as really fundamental issues that have shaped Serbia's view today. Deep historical wounds, basically.
And there was that comparison used involving Belgium to make a point about Serbia's approach.
Ah, yeah, that was quite a sharp comparison. The speaker basically asked the audience to imagine Belgium being bombed, losing territory, and then being expected to join the entity involved without any apology or policy change being demanded. It implies Serbia's initial approach was maybe uniquely forgiving or emotionally driven.
Okay, I see. Highlighting that past emotional investment.
Yeah, exactly. Which then sets up the next point.
Which is the call for a shift, moving away from that emotion.
Yes. A definite call to move towards rationality, pragmatism, looking at things from a perspective of Serbia's own interests.
A more strategic view, less sentimental.
That's the idea, a clear-eyed assessment of the pros and cons of the EU relationship.
And the speech also looked back at why Serbia was initially so keen on the EU, didn't it? Those early reasons.
It did. It outlined the initial drivers, which are now being questioned. Things like the hope for peace and stability in Europe, driven by the EU.
Okay, peace is stability.
Economic development, prosperity.
Naturally.
And of course, democratic values. Those were the big draws initially. But the speech argues the EU hasn't quite delivered on these fronts.
Right. Let's dig into that disillusionment. The EU's role in Yugoslavia's dissolution and the NATO intervention seems key here.
Very key. From this perspective, the EU wasn't a neutral peacemaker. The speaker suggests the EU actively contributed to the breakup of SFRJ and supported NATO's military actions against Yugoslavia and Republika Srpska. So questioning its role in bringing peace or justice, especially for Serbian victims.
So a feeling of being sided against.
Pretty much, yeah, during those really critical moments.
And then there's Kosovo. And the Brussels Agreement.
Yeah.
That seems like a major source of friction.
Huge. Kosovo's recognition is framed as, well, a betrayal of sovereignty. But the focus then shifts heavily to the Brussels Agreement.
The community of Serb municipalities part.
Exactly that. The fact that it hasn't been implemented after, 12 years? That's presented as a core reason for this deep mistrust now. A feeling of being strung along, essentially.
12 years, yeah. That's understandable frustration, if that's the perspective.
And it builds on that point, talking about the treatment of Serbs in Kosovo.
Okay, what specifically was mentioned there?
Well, the speech alleges a pattern of abuse tolerated by Pristina governments. Things like property seizures, issues with voting rights, arrests, even expulsions.
Serious allegations.
Very. And the criticism is that the EU's response has been weak. Mostly just words, verbal condemnation, without any real action to stop what the speaker calls terror against Serbs there.
Right. Moving on, the migrant crisis also got mentioned. Comparing the EU's response to Serbia's.
Yes. The EU's handling was criticized as, divided and ineffective even after years. Some countries opening borders, others using the military.
The lack of unity.
Definitely. And Serbia, in contrast, is portrayed as managing it independently, more humanely perhaps, but also making it clear it wouldn't become like a holding camp.
A parking lot, I think was the term used.
That's the one. And also a perception that EU aid was mostly just to increase Serbia's capacity to host migrants, which wasn't Serbia's goal.
Okay. And then COVID-19, another point of contention.
Yeah, another example cited as showing a lack of EU solidarity. The initial border closures between EU states, the competition for medical gear, export bans.
Right, that initial scramble.
It apparently left a bad impression in Serbia. And this was contrasted with aid from China, which was described as sincere and unconditional, influencing views on China alignment, perhaps.
I see. Okay, shifting to wider geopolitics now. The Middle East and Ukraine crises, how were they viewed?
Critically, the EU's efforts in the Middle East were seen as, well, pretty unsuccessful. And on Ukraine, the argument was that the EU's policy backing Ukraine against Russia has actually weakened its global standing.
Weakened its ability to mediate, maybe?
That seems to be the implication. And then there's the demand for Serbia to align with the EU against Russia, which brings up perceived double standards on border inviolability.
Which leads directly into the Serbia-Russia relationship that's obviously complex.
Deeply historical, yes. The speech really stressed the long-standing alliance, Russia's support for Serbia historically.
So imposing sanctions is seen as
a betrayal, basically, and ignoring the potential economic fallout for Serbia itself. There was also a reference to the Minsk agreements, suggesting maybe the current conflict could have been avoided.
Okay. But despite that strong feeling towards Russia, the speech did acknowledge the EU's economic importance, right?
Oh, absolutely. It recognizes the EU is the biggest trade partner, and there's a desire to keep that economic cooperation going. But
There's a but.
There's a but. Concerns about the EU's own economic future, if politics keeps overriding, economic common sense, worries it could harm the EU and, by extension, Serbia.
And part of that concern related to the EU's relationship with the U.S. administration.
Yes. The speech criticized what it saw as the EU just unconditionally following the U.S. lead, specifically under President Trump's administration, arguing this has actually hurt the EU economy, less activity, more inflation, less investment.
Reversing previous prosperity is the claim.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
That the EU isn't acting in its own best economic interests because of this alignment.
Any specific examples given?
Two are highlighted. One was the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, questioning the EU's quiet response and suggesting Russia wasn't responsible.
Okay.
And the second was the big push now for increased military spending in the EU, a real shift from the past reluctance, questioning the impact this might have on, say, investment and trade.
Right. And what about the economic cost to Serbia if it did impose sanctions on Russia? Was that quantified?
It was. The estimate mentioned was around 4 billion euros lost annually just in trade.
That's significant.
And that's before considering energy costs. Getting gas at market prices would mean higher costs for everything: heating, transport, electricity, fertilizer, driving inflation, hitting savings.
And EU investments in Serbia, was there a concern there too?
Yeah, the point was made that some EU investment is attracted because Serbia has good trade deals with the Eurasian Economic Union. So would that investment stay if Serbia ditched those markets and faced higher energy costs like the EU?
It's a valid question from their perspective.
And the overall estimated financial hit for Serbia, if it followed the EU's Russia policy, was put at least 15 billion euros.
Wow.
With, crucially, no expectation that the EU would compensate for those losses, reinforcing the argument against alignment.
Okay, so a strong economic case being made against following the EU line on Russia. Shifting gears slightly, what about values? The speech argued the EU's democratic values have changed.
Yes, that was another major theme. The idea that the old ideals, brotherhood, equality, freedom, don't seem to match the EU's current actions.
And the example given was Ukraine and Moldova's potential accession.
Exactly. Suggesting they're being fast-tracked for membership, maybe without meeting all the usual criteria, primarily because they're in conflict with Russia, implying that's the new main requirement, one Serbia won't meet.
And were there criticisms of things happening within the EU itself? Regarding democracy or rights?
There were. Several examples of alleged double standards were cited. Minority rights issues for Serbs in Croatia. Blocking candidates in Romania, attempts to suppress parties like AfD in Germany or the Freedom Party in Austria, hindering Le Pen in France. Questioning if the EU applies its principles consistently, even internally.
And corruption.
And NGOs.
Yeah, questioning if corruption accusations are only leveled at opponents of Brussels. And suggesting a closer look at how Brussels funds NGOs worldwide, referencing President Trump and Elon Musk on that topic.
Right. Then a pretty strong claim about colored revolutions.
Yes, the assertion was that tactics allegedly used by the EU to support regime change elsewhere are now being turned against elected leaders within the EU, like Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia.
Raising concerns about respect for member state sovereignty.
That's the implication. And linked to that were criticisms about media freedom in the EU.
How so?
Allegations of suppressing dissenting media, banning Russian-linked channels, seizing Russian assets. This was contrasted with Serbia's media scene, described as more open, and its protection of property rights, with the irony noted that the EU might label Serbia a dictatorship for not doing those things. Interesting contrast being drawn there. What about the idea of shared values?
Well, the speaker referenced an EU rapporteur saying the EU shares fewer values now with Russia, China, and even the US.
Okay.
And countered that Serbia does share values with all three, and then questioned the EU's alignment with the current government in Syria, given its makeup.
So, positioning Serbia as having broader value alignments?
Seemingly so, which led into a critique of specific liberal values from the EU.
What kind of values?
Things related to gender identity, sexuality, and what was described as the declining importance of tradition, religion, nation, family.
And contrasting this with?
With the values expressed by U.S. President Trump, the speaker stated a closer affinity for Trump's focus on God, nation, family, compared to what were termed the EU's globalist values.
Right. And finally, the speech addressed protests happening within Serbia itself.
Yes, with a very direct claim that these protests aren't spontaneous, but are orchestrated from outside by Western intelligence services in Brussels, according to the speaker, with the alleged goal of replacing President Vučić with a government that would recognize Kosovo, abandon Republika Srpska, and impose sanctions on Russia, aligning with those EU policies.
Okay, so a claim of external interference aimed at regime change.
A very pointed one, yes, which all leads to the final conclusion of the speech.
Disillusionment.
Profound disillusionment. The statement was that the EU is no longer the admired beacon it once was, that it's lost its moral authority to guide or judge Serbia.
And the dream of a united Europe hasn't matched reality.
Exactly. A dream of free, equal nations facing a reality, in the speaker's view, of an EU that doesn't actually want Serbia. Though support from some MEPs, Czech, Slovak, German AfD, Hungarian Fidesz, was noted at the conference.
So yeah, a really comprehensive, deeply critical assessment of the EU-Serbia relationship delivered, interestingly, right inside the European Parliament.
It certainly lays out the Serbian government's current viewpoint very clearly. A significant shift in rhetoric, definitely, about Serbia's potential EU path.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.